Hi, my name is Shannon A, and today I'm going to give you a story about a princess and a giant. It's actually called The Princess and the Giant. Once upon a time, there was a princess named Princess Sophie. And Princess Sophie loved to play in her backyard where a tall beanstalk grew. And of course, in most fairy tales, a giant lived at the top of this beanstalk. Well, one day Sophie was playing, and all she heard was a lot of loud ruckus, like she always does every night. So at supper time, she asked her parents, why is it that the giant up at the top of the beanstalk is always so loud, grouchy, and mean? And Mom said, well, dear, it's just because that's the way it's always been. And Dad said, and that's the way it's going to always be. And if you don't believe me, then check this out. And he grabs a book off the bookshelf and he hands it to Sophie. It's a book of fairy tales. And Dad says, read it for yourself every night. So Sophie, that night, she decided to read the book because, of course, the giant was so loud no one could sleep. And Sophie's first story was about a boy who had encountered a giant who lived at the top of a beanstalk. That was really mean. Well, the second story Sophie read was about a witch who had made a house out of gingerbread. And well, at that point, her stomach was grumbling, and she couldn't sleep. So she sat there thinking, and she came up with a bright idea. So Sophie jumped up and she grabbed her backpack and she ran up the beanstalk all the way to the top. And when she reached the top, she knocked on the giant's door. And then the giant came, fee, fi, fo, fum. Whoever that is, they better run. Well, Sophie, being the brave little princess that she is, she didn't run. Sophie stood there and she said timidly, my name is Princess Sophie, and well, I thought I'd bring you some warm porridge to help you sleep at night. And so the giant took the porridge. He said, this isn't enough to feed a fly, but he still ate it. And he gave the pot back to Sophie and said, goodbye, and he slammed the door. Well, Sophie went back home, and she tried to sleep that night, but of course the giant was still grumpy and growling. So Sophie, she tried to sleep and she came up with yet another idea. At that point, Sophie, she grabbed up some things and she put on her backpack and she ran back up the beanstalk. And she knocked. Fee, fi, fo, fum. Who's that knocking? Oh, what do you want? And while Sophie said, well, I just thought that you might need something. And so it works for me at night. I always sleep with my friend Fluffy. So Sophie had brought all these stuffed animals just for the giant to choose to sleep with. She made him supper. He ate his supper. And he said, that's not going to work for me. And she said, well, it doesn't hurt to try. So the giant grabbed up the biggest stuffed animal that Sophie brought, and he went to his room. Well, Sophie left, and that night the giant still didn't get any sleep. He was still grumpy and loud and mean. And so the next day, the dad was like, something's got to be done about that giant. And well, Sophie was like, well, maybe Dad, just like in the book that I was reading, he has a pea that is bothering him, just like the princess who had the pea in her bed. She said, maybe his bed is just too lumpy. So Sophie had yet another great idea. So she packed up some things. She grabbed her backpack, ran back up to the top of the beanstalk, and she knocked on the door. Fee, fi, fo, fum. Oh, well, come on in, have some tea with me. So Sophie went in and she said, I bought you something. She pulled out a comfortable pillow, a comfortable comfy blanket, and some cushion for his bed. And she set it all nice and neat. And in that night, the giant lay down, but he still couldn't sleep. So as Sophie was leaving, soldiers was coming because at that point the king and queen had it. And so Sophie, she didn't know what to do, but then she thought about the things that she does, and she ran back and she said, you know what, Mr. Giant, I haven't been giving you a bedtime story. So Sophie tucked him in and tucked the comforter right over his chin, gave him his stuffed animal, and she began to read him fairy tales from her book. And at that point, before you know it, the giant was fast asleep. He was so asleep. And not only that, but the soldiers that were on their way up the beanstalk had fallen asleep too. Well, at that point, Sophie had saved the day, and the town was so elated that they decided to have a celebration. Yay! Sophie saves the day! And the great part about it is the giant didn't have to be taken away. So, at the end of the day, everyone lived happily ever after, and Sophie even taught the giant how to read on his own. The end.